Spain and Portugal today are often known for beautiful weather, sparkling beaches, and majestic architecture. The Romans have also left many traces of their empire behind, not only in the descendant languages of Spanish and Portuguese, but in the remnants of their grand works that dot the landscape, such as the aqueducts of Segovia, the ruins of Celtiberian, or the walls of Lugo. Yet both Celtiberian and Lugo were not originally Roman cities. They had been captured by the Romans from an even earlier group, the Celts. While many people associate Ireland, Britain, and Gaul with the Celts, they likewise had a very significant impact in Spain and Portugal. Yet where these Celts originally came from, when, and the details of their culture, lives, and ethnic makeup have been hotly debated for decades. Today, many people in parts of Spain and Portugal still identify with these ancient Celts, ascribing various local traditions to them. Yet what are the true origins of the Celtic presence in Iberia? How widespread was it? And do they really have a large genetic legacy in the region? Were they connected to Ireland, as Gaelic legends suggest? What are the true origins of the Iberian Celts? Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. You can follow me on Facebook or X, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thank you all for your generous support through Patreon or through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube. The story of the Celtic presence in Iberia is complex, but its roots begin in the Bronze Age. By around 2500 BC, people carrying ancestry derived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe begin to appear in isolated cases in the archaeological record of Iberia. They were typically buried in single graves, accompanied by bows, arrows, copper daggers, and copper wristbands. This was a new culture, a new people, partly derived from a population which developed on the steppelands of Eastern Europe. These people are known as the Bell Beaker people, named for their particular style of pottery and burial customs. At the very same time that they were appearing in Spain and Portugal, they were likewise appearing in Ireland, Britain, France, Italy, and many other places. They spoke a language derived from Proto-Indo-European, which had developed in Eastern Europe, and is the ancestor of most European languages as well as Sanskrit and Iranian. However, the Bell Beaker people would have already been speaking a particular dialect, one which gave rise to the languages we later find in Western Europe where they settled. In the past, it was believed that the Bell Beaker style of pottery originated in Iberia around 2700 BC, apparently predating the Indo-European arrival there. This led to theories about the pre-Indo-European Iberians being the progenitors of the Bell Beaker culture. However, it is now known through genetic studies that those we call Bell Beakers were of Indo-European origin. Possibly, the similarities in pottery are coincidental and regional developments of the corded ware style, or are the result of stylistic imitations. While the Neolithic population of Iberia had largely descended from Western and Central European hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers, the incoming steppe-derived population had a large impact on the local genetic pool. It's estimated that around 40% of the gene pool of late Bronze Age Iberia was contributed by this steppe-derived Indo-European population, though their genetic impact was not felt equally. They were much more numerous in the north, central, and western coast of the country, whereas in the south, along the Mediterranean, their genetic impact was much smaller. This corresponds to later history, where those who spoke non-Indo-European languages predominantly dwelt along the Mediterranean coast, save for the Basques. The reason for this distribution corresponds to how the Indo-Europeans settled in Iberia. They didn't march across the Pyrenees. They sailed. No, not across the mountains, of course, but around them. while the Belbeeker people dwelling in the region of the modern Netherlands were sailing across the Channel to occupy Britain and Ireland. They were likewise following the coastline of Europe westward. Eventually, this would bring them to Spain, and around the coast to Portugal. The remains of Bronze Age boats have been recovered in Britain, which show a high level of sophistication of these crafts, which were able to withstand the force of the Atlantic Ocean, at least in regions not too distant from the coast. Though they may have begun as pastoralists, and in Iberia they did remain predominantly pastoral for thousands of years, those who had taken up dwelling near the coast, perhaps initially along the Baltic Sea, had likewise become masters of the waves. They painted images of their ships on stone, and represented them in fine metalwork, even sometimes as the vehicle the sun used to traverse the sky. They used those ships to spread to the furthest western shores of Europe. By 2000 BC, the Belbeeker settlers had established a strong presence in Iberia, especially the north and west, and the power of their descendants would continue to develop over the course of the Bronze Age. Yet what does any of this have to do with the Celts? Possibly everything. After the initial inflow of the Indo-European Belbeeker people, which started with a trickle in 2500 BC, and built into a demographic transformation by 2000 BC, things did not remain static. The male haplogroups associated with the Belbeeker population gained overwhelming predominance in Iberia, especially in the north, showing the genetic success of the incoming population. Even among the Basque people, these R1b male haplogroups became overwhelmingly dominant, despite the retention of their non-Indo-European language, showing that the males from the incoming steppe-derived population were being integrated into Basque society, and were highly successful despite not causing a language shift. Genetic studies also show that though the male line was successful, there were far fewer steppe-derived female lines, showing that the majority of the incoming population was male, and were predominantly wedding local women. The Indo-European-based population became dominant in the north and center, which the Roman historian Strabo describes in the following way. Now, of Iberia, the larger part affords but poor means of livelihood, for most of the inhabited country consists of mountains, forests, and plains, whose soil is thin, and even that not uniformly well watered. And northern Iberia, in addition to its ruggedness, not only is extremely cold, but lies next to the ocean, and thus has acquired its characteristic of inhospitality and aversion to intercourse with other countries. Consequently, it is an exceedingly wretched place to live in. Such, then, is the character of the northern parts. Of course, his interpretation is highly subjective. I personally really love northern Iberia. But some of his geological features compared to Mediterranean Iberia has some truth. This was part of the reason for the dominance of the Indo-Europeans in these regions. The existing population there would have been much smaller than in the south, and their migration into that region therefore had the greatest impact. By 1300 BC, this had developed into an archaeologically recognized regional system along the Atlantic seaboard, bound together by trade, and termed the Atlantic Bronze Age. But far more than goods were being exchanged. The Levergevale Erin tells of the sons of Mil, the progenitor of the Gaels, a son of Bile, who is a son of Breogan, the king of Spain. Though the story as we know it was a Christian fabrication, it was built upon a pre-Christian foundation and reworked to fit their biblical scheme. The jeweler god, Credna, was said to have died when his ship sunk, making the journey from Spain to Ireland with a load of gold to use in his work. This too recalls the ancient trade connections between Ireland and Iberia, where the massive gold mine of Las Medulas began as a Celtic mining site, later developed by the Roman Empire. Two distinct theories have been presented to explain the rise of the Celts in Iberia. The first is that within this old Indo-European Atlantic community, the Celtic language, or a variation of it, developed as a native evolution of the dialect, closely related perhaps with that which developed in more central and eastern regions of Gaul. The other is that Proto-Celtic speakers of the Urnfield culture migrated west into Spain at some point, gaining control over the region west to the Ebro River, and then from there spreading the Celtic language even further westward. The invasion theory has long been the dominant view. Ancient Roman historian Appian in his Iberia says, "However, I think that the Celts, passing over the Pyrenees at some former time, mingled with the natives, and that the name Celtiberia originated in that way." Though working from far less data than we have today, Appian's view appears to be correct, though the time frame for this is likely much earlier than he and many other recent scholars believed. Celtic is commonly divided into Q-Celtic and P-Celtic forms. Celtiberian, for which a number of inscriptions survive, was a Q-Celtic language, like that of Ireland. The Gaulish language was a P-Celtic language, like that of Britain. Proto-Celtic did not have a P. Old Gaelic ken is Welsh pen, but Proto-Celtic quenum. This language evolution shows that Celtiberian was outside of Gaulish influence during this major linguistic development, as was Gaelic. However, we do not only have linguistic evidence for this Celtic migration, there is also genetic evidence. Sometime in the late Bronze Age, there was another noticeable genetic influx into Iberia. It carried genetic signatures similar to those of the Urnfield culture. They had higher levels of steppe-derived ancestry than the earlier Bronze Age population, and were most heavily concentrated within the area of the Celtiberians, though not restricted to this region. It is estimated that they contributed between 28 to 43% of the ancestry of the late Bronze Age samples from a Celtiberian site, but also between 11 and 31% of two Tartessian samples, and 10 to 15% among 15 samples along the Mediterranean, showing that the Urnfield period influx had a dramatic impact, even beyond the regions which would become Celtic-speaking. Surprisingly, the genetics of the Basque population, who dwelt in close contact with the Celtiberians, shows that they are the closest modern relatives to this early Iron Age population, with a relatively high level of steppe ancestry despite speaking a non-Indo-European language. Likely due to their region and language barrier, they were sheltered from later Roman period and medieval migrations, and are in effect a preserve of this wider Celtic Iron Age Iberia. The Tartessian language is recorded on various monuments in the south of Spain and Portugal, dating to around the 6th century BC. Scholar John T. Koch and some others have argued that the language can be understood as Celtic. This is viewed by most linguists as extremely unlikely. However, there was a fairly significant Celtic influence in this area, and now we have genetic proof of it. As early as Herodotus, the Tartessians were identified as dwelling beside the Celts. A story is recorded about the Tartessian king Arganthonius, whose name appears based on a Proto-Celtic word arganto, meaning silver. Similar names appear recorded in the region during Roman times, as well as in Gaul. He was explained as a descendant of the Coni tribe, whose name is explained as coming from the Proto-Celtic word quon, meaning hound. Thus, by at least 625 BC, the Celtic influence had spread from Celtiberia all the way to the western coast of Iberia. Possibly the tale reflects the Celtic conquest of Tartessos, which may have influenced the names and elements of the language, even if the language itself is not to be understood as Celtic. As Appian believed, it is almost certain that the Proto-Celts crossed the Pyrenees and settled on the west side of the Ebro River. This was where the most powerful Celtic cities like Numantia were located. From here, they spread southwest all the way to the coast in a relatively short time, crossing the loosely populated central regions without too much difficulty. This was the origin of the Celtici and Coni, who were situated south of the Lusitanians, in southwestern Portugal and Spain. They had likely established themselves there by at least 700 BC. During the Iron Age, the Celtici would expand their territories northward along the coast of Portugal and into the territories of the Galaici, while the Coni or the Cunetes expanded south. Because of the Greek account of Arganthonios in Tartessos, we have a relatively clear idea that the Celtic influence must have spread throughout Iberia very early on. Arganthonios is dated to 625. They were also very likely influencing their region just to the north. Potentially, Galatia is actually one of the later places to be Celticized, and the presence occasionally of P sounds and non-Celtic features in the region are perhaps a trace of their pre-Celtic Indo-European language that are still remaining. Within the historical period, Roman writers such as Strabo differentiate the Galaici from the Celtici. However, whether identified with the specific Celtic tribes or not, most scholars agree that well before the time of the Roman presence in the region, most of the people of central, northern, and western Iberia were speaking a Celtic language. Formed during the late days of the Bronze Age Atlantic complex, a castroculture, the archaeological name for the regional culture that developed in Galicia, Asturias, and northern Portugal. These sites are often referred to as Celtic, though arguably they are not originally Celtic in form. Rather, they belong to the culture created by the pre-Celtic Indo-Europeans, the Bell-Beakers and their descendants. In Ireland, Britain, parts of the Gaulish coast, and the northern coast of Iberia, these cultural forms remain dominant even after Celticization. When the Iberian Celts emerge into history, they are organized into many different regional and local tribal affiliations that just in our surviving sources number in the hundreds. Like in Ireland and much of early Iron Age Britain, the lifestyle and economy was primarily based around a type of pastoralism that revolved around the movement between summer and winter pasture lands. The Hillforts were in part to control pastures and cattle, as well as centers where elites and craftsmen would dwell, and where assemblies of the tribe were hosted. Some of these locations evolved into towns and cities, while others linger on as the many Iron Age archaeological sites marveled at today. Lugo, the most prominent city in Galicia, may have been first established by the Lugui tribe. The city of Braga in Portugal was founded by the Bracari tribe, and later was re-established as a Roman oppida. It was recorded that when defending the city, the women fought alongside the men and never retreated from battle. Conistorgis was said by Strabo to be one of the most notable cities among the Celtici who dwelt near Tartessos, though its exact location is unknown today. Among the Celtiberians, Numantia, based on the Celtic word for a sacred place, Nematon, was a city praised by the Roman and Greek sources as being both large and powerful. Segobriga is another Celtiberian city, the Roman period remains of which are some of the best preserved in Spain. There are hundreds of other sites, place names, towns, and cities throughout central, western, and northern Iberia, which are of Celtic origin, and whose people still trace their roots back to Celtic tribes. Now, despite having developed towns and cities, Romans and Greeks were still of the opinion that the Celts, especially those dwelling in northern Iberia, were more barbaric and warlike than their non-Celtic counterparts along the Mediterranean coast. Strabo says, The Artabrians have many thickly peopled cities on that gulf which the sailors who frequent those parts call the harbor of the Artabrians. Now about 30 different tribes occupy the country between the Tagus and the Artabrians. And although the country was blessed in fruits and cattle, and in the abundance of its gold and silver and similar metals, still most of the people had ceased to gain their livelihood from the earth, and were spending their time in brigandage and in continuous warfare with each other and with their neighbors across the Tagus. This type of warfare, which he ascribes to nearly all the Celtic peoples in Iberia, could equally describe early medieval Ireland. He likewise says of them, "Up to the time of Brutus, they used boats of tanned leather on account of the flood tides and the shoal waters. These are the same type of leather boats known in Gaelic as currach, and which Gaels of Ireland and Scotland continued to use in some cases into the modern era. Of the eating culture of the Galaici, Asturians, and other nearby peoples, Posidonius reports, 2/3 of the year they eat acorns, which they have first dried and crushed, and then ground up and made into a bread that may be stored away for a long time. They also drink beer, but they are scarce of wine, and what wine they have may be speedily drunk up in merry feastings with their kinsfolk. And instead of olive oil they use butter. Again, they dine sitting down, for they have stationary seats built around the walls of the room, though they seat themselves forward according to age and rank." The success or failure of the acorn harvest is also something frequently remarked upon in Irish annals, though whether this was used for flour or just as animal fodder isn't entirely clear. An identical practice is recorded by Herodotus about the ancient Pelasgians, whom he said were responsible for the Temple of Dodona, as an explanation as to why the oak was sacred to Zeus. The seating arrangement is likewise akin to what's described in the Irish tales of Conhovar's palace at Ewen Macha, or the Tower of the Gaels, where each is assigned his seat according to his art. Among the various Celtic groups in Iberia towards the 3rd century BC, the so-called Celtiberians were the most economically developed and powerful, Strabo says. Again, of the 4 divisions into which the Celtiberians have been separated, the most powerful, generally speaking, are the Avacans, who live on the east and south, where their territory joins Carpentania and the sources of the Tagus, and they have a city of very great renown, Numantia. Celtiberians were rich as well as numerous, albeit the country they live in is rather poor. The Celtiberian horses are like those of Parthia, for not only are they faster, but they are also smoother runners than other horses. The Cantabrians, also still a self-identified population in modern Spain, were likewise a Celtic-speaking people prior to the Roman conquest. The name is likely derived from Celtic cant, meaning a border, rim, or corner, cognate with the British place name Kent. The women of the Iberian Celts seem to have held a higher status than they did in Roman or Greek society. Classical era historians remark upon the fierceness and independence of the Celtic women. It seems that women would regularly fight in battle alongside men when they were fighting in defense of their town, city, or family, but that they did not accompany men in the type of raiding warfare mentioned earlier. They also worked in fields, while men may have been primarily responsible for cattle. Cantabrian women specifically were given dowries by their husbands, and their daughters were left as the heirs, while the sons were married off by their sisters. To the Roman and Greek historians, this was considered woman rule and the height of barbarism. But similar customs are recorded among other Celtic groups such as the Picts. In many Indo-European societies, the woman was the representation of sovereignty, which becomes expressed in stronger or weaker forms depending on the local traditions that develop. freedom for the Iberian Celts was also a very high value. The women of the Cantabrians were said to put their own children to death rather than allow them to be taken captive, and men would likewise suicide rather than being taken as slaves. Strabo remarks that this was a common trait to Celts as well as Scythians and Thracians, all of whom valued their freedom above their own lives in many cases. Though every region had its uniqueness and operated tribally, we can see from surviving evidence that there were many commonalities across the Celtic world, and possibly more so between the Iberian and the Irish Celts, who likewise spoke a Q form of Celtic, and had similar pastoral-focused economies, and are recorded as worshipping some of the same gods. By the 3rd century BC, the Celts of Iberia, along with their Mediterranean-dwelling neighbors, were beginning to develop strong centers of power and large cities. And these things began to draw the attention of growing regional powers such as Carthage and Rome. Though the Celts played some role in aiding the Iberians during the invasion of the Carthaginians in the 3rd century BC, and during the Punic Wars as mercenaries, it wasn't until the defeat of the Carthaginians and the conquest of their territorial holdings in Iberia by the Romans that the Celts entered the scene as a major military player in their own right. Local Iberians dwelling along the Mediterranean coast were in almost constant rebellion against Rome, and eventually they managed to put together an alliance with the Celtic tribes to their north to push the Romans out. In 197, a Celt-Iberian army of around 20,000 did battle with the Romans along their border near modern Mengabar, and in 195 another army of 10,000 was sent to reinforce their Turdetani allies. Cato the Elder led an army to confront the Celts and retake the lands in rebellion, and managed to convince the Celts to desist from their offense. But by 185 the Celts had raised another large force, and defeated 2 Roman armies before being halted near the Tagus River. When the Romans responded with an offense of their own near Celtic territory, the Celts raised an army of 35,000 and prepared for full-scale war. This was the beginning of what became known as the Celt-Iberian Wars, and the eventual Roman conquest of most of the Celt-Iberian tribes by 152 BC. After decades of conflict and heavy losses on both sides. That the Celt-Iberians were able to go toe-to-toe with the Romans over decades of large-scale fighting is impressive in itself, and shows that these were no mere barbarians. From their interactions with the Iberian Celts, the Romans would come to adopt the gladius, modeled after the Celt-Iberian swords, and whose name is based on the Celtic word for a sword, cladivus. It may be also the case that it was from the Celt-Iberians that the Romans adopted chainmail, and the technology seems to have been something developed by the Celts in both Iberia and Gaul. For over 100 years, there was nearly constant war and rebellions in Iberia as the Romans strove to subdue the population, and the Celts and Lusitanians fought to resist. Many of these wars were openly driven by Roman greed, as was the case with Lucius Lucullus, who launched what was considered even by the Romans themselves as an illegal war against the Vacaei, who had always maintained good relations with Rome. He marched his army on the unsuspecting tribe and demanded that they hand over the city to him. They agreed and let his army enter, which proceeded to kill every military-age man in the city under his orders. Nearly 20,000 men were murdered in cold blood and open treachery by the civilized Romans. This is only one instance of many such bloody events which marked the gradual conquest of Iberia by the Romans. It wasn't until 19 BC that the Romans finally subdued all the Iberian Celts, in the conclusion of the Cantabrian Wars, which pitted the Galaici, Astures, and Cantabrians against the forces of Caesar Augustus. The reason for the war seems to have been the Roman desire to seize the gold mines of Las Medulas, which would become the most productive gold mines in the Roman Empire. There was no military necessity for the war. Against the entire might of the Roman Empire, the brave warriors of northern Iberia held out for 10 years. After being subsumed into the Roman Empire, like in Gaul, the local peoples began to lose their language. It isn't known exactly when the Iberian Celtic language or languages died out, but in remote areas like Galicia, Asturias, and Cantabria, it likely outlasted the empire, dying out sometime in the early Middle Ages, lingering on in isolated villages long after it had died away in large settlements, in something like the situation that modern Gaelic finds itself in today, unfortunately. However, even after the languages were lost, many aspects of the local identities remained. Festivals are still celebrated that consciously trace their roots back to the Celtic past. Some find this controversial or a modern rewriting of Iberian identity to latch on to the Celts. This view is based on the misunderstanding of Iberian origins and history, and just how Celtic much of Iberia really was. Despite Roman period immigration, the migration of the Suevian Visigoths, and the influx during the Islamic conquest, the core of the Iberian population remained. As long as there are those in Iberia who continue the traditions and the memory of their ancestors, though we may say the Romans conquered them, it cannot be said that there are no Celts in Iberia. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching and for your support, and as always, stand tall.